Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Principles of Effective Feedback, Giving and Receiving Feedback. Before before I begin the workshop, I wanted to start with the fact that I live and work in the Toronto in the dish with one spoon territory. So the dish with one spoon territory is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bond them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And with that, also a brief introduction to me. So I am educational developer at the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. Before that, I completed my PhD in molecular science at TMU, and now I teach as a contract lecturer in the Chang School of Continuing Education. Most of these are lower liberal or upper liberal courses, and fun fact, I also love hiking, watching Netflix, and music. And I'm excited to talk about feedback, which is a key component of teaching that I usually think about. And I'm excited to kind of break that down here with us. So, first of all, I was inspired by the book from Fink, which I will be referring to throughout the course, throughout the workshop. But it's basically says what explains the powerful motivation in sports, even when teams lose, right? Athletes lose often, and even the best teams lose, yet they stay motivated. How and why? In sports, well, they have a scoreboard, which provides quick, reliable performance data. And they have clear criteria and immediate results, and often an applause associated with it. Players know instantly whether their jump shot worked or not, and how they can improve the next time. In education, feedback plays the same role when we think about it. Students need clear criteria, prompt feedback, and repeated opportunities to improve. So if we want high performance in learning, we need to design for it, just like sports do. Who would have thought? So by the end of this session, hopefully you'll be able to examine how to give effective feedback and make feedback a key part of your course design and support student feedback literacy, and also develop a plan for instructor self-reflection. Effective feedback does not stand alone. So this is another key thing I want to emphasize, is that it must be integrated into course design. And if we look at Creating Significant Learning Experiences book, an integrated approach to designing courses by Fink, these are the steps required to build strong primary components in course design. So first, it's identifying your important situational factors, which is, for example, how many students are enrolled in your course, what stage of their studies are they at, what goals, what are the larger program or curriculum learning outcomes there are, and for instance, if they're taking another part 2 course, etc., what are the milestones that they need to hit? And then 2 is identifying the important learning goals for your course and for your assessments. And then after that is when feedback comes in, formulating appropriate feedback and assessment procedures. So again, reiterating that feedback is not an afterthought, but it's intentionally designed in your course. There are 3 different types of feedback, which is often confused. So these 3 types are appreciation, so praise and gratitude, coaching, suggestions for improvements, and evaluation, so measuring performance against standards. Now, where challenges with feedback come in is when there's insufficient feedback or an inappropriate balance between praise and critique. The process, so lack of valuing the process, like timing and lack of evaluation strategies. And there's also a huge emotional component to it. So, for example, when people receive criticism in high stakes environments, and especially when there's grades associated with the type of feedback that they're getting. Research shows that dissatisfaction with feedback systems globally, and I think we also agree with that. So Stone and Heen summarize the problem perfectly. When we give feedback, we notice the receiver isn't good at receiving it. When we receive feedback, we notice that the giver isn't good at giving it. So both sides struggle. This leads to feedback literacy. What is feedback literacy? Feedback literacy includes the ability to identify common ground, to reflect on feedback, manage emotions productively, and act deliberately on feedback. So it's not just about giving it feedback well, but it's also about helping students use it well and giving them a purpose, like a clear learning goal and performance, like that sports analogy that we had. And again, goes back to really defining our learning goals for our learners and communicating that to them so that when they do receive the feedback, they're not so taken aback or surprised. And when putting this workshop together, I wanted to find a definition of feedback, but there was a study by Spooner al. which they looked at literature around feedback and found that only 14% of publications actually had a clear definition of feedback. But some that did, they basically identified core components of feedback, which is information about performance, a dialogue between learner and teacher, a reflection on the feedback that they receive, and action for improvement. The reflection could also be like reflecting on the self and taking action and being a learner that's involved in their own learning journey. So the essence of feedback is that they make sense of information and using it for enhancement purposes. So it also means that the timing in which we provide feedback is important, which brings me to the point of two types of feedback, formative and summative. So this is also interrelated with assessment. So I thought about also talking about that today. Formative feedback is supposed to guide learning. It's low or no grade weight. It's ongoing and often informal. Summative feedback, on the other hand, is linked to grades. It's end of unit or course. It's more formal, and it's generally tied to high stakes assessments, like maybe a final presentation, etc. And again, formative feedback is more low stakes assignments or maybe just for no grades at all that's assigned to it. And when there's no grades, students feel more safer and more so focused on the actual feedback that they're getting. Instead of seeing it as a justification for the grade, and that's when negative attitudes and emotions can really kick in. So basically, the other important thing to do is to look at feedback versus assessment. We design assessments in a course, and again, feedback is different from assessment in two ways. One is grades, and then it's dialogue. So assessments affects grades, feedback does not. Assessment is announced to the learner, but feedback is discussed. It's more of an ongoing dialogue between learner and instructor. And so, for example, for an assessment, you could say you got 75%. For this feedback, you say discussion about strengths and areas to grow, and they start to feel safe and actually be able to take that in. When looking at literature, often when instructors think that their assessment or feedback is formative, it usually doesn't match the student perspective, so the student perceptions. Students think that even formative assessments, in their eyes, as summative. They take it very seriously, and basically that often interferes with the intended educational effect of feedback. And it may not really drive learner development as hoped. So when feedback feels like judgment, they may become defensive, avoid reflection, and protect self-esteem. So to truly benefit from coaching, from when you're an instructor and more of a coach, learners must feel safe, be willing to be vulnerable, and risk trying new approaches. So having low stakes formative assessments can help instead of high stakes and assessments and where grades are largely affected. Low stakes, where there's no grades attached to the feedback, is when it's most taken in as using the feedback to perform better over time. However, low stakes assessments is also subjective. So again, where literature shows that mismatch between learner and instructor, and how they think about them. So I would suggest being clear to your students about the purpose of particular assignments and feedback throughout the course, and also to check in with your colleagues. For example, hey, does this, I have these assignments, I'm scaffolding this assignment this way and providing feedback. What do you think about it? So getting that input is really great. And then also, Fink basically has two different types of ways in which they look at assessment and feedback. So there's this auditive assessment and educative assessment. Auditive assessment looks backwards into what did they learn. It's grading, and its core function is grading and compliance. And also the judgment is announced to the learner. Educative assessment is forward-looking. So it's working with the learner to develop a plan to perform better by the end of whatever assignment it is or learning goal there is. And it focuses on self-assessment and dialogue, where the student becomes more an agent in their learning. There's also this Fidelity feedback framework, which I'm going to introduce you to that in a second, and it provides meaningful growth. So taking a look at what are we asking them to do, and how might it be perceived, and what are the goals of it, and the functions of those assignments. So the Fidelity framework, basically this acronym means that if we want our feedback to be educative rather than just tell students what grade they got, the feedback needs to be frequent, immediate, discriminating, so based on clear criteria and standards, and delivered lovingly, in other words, supportively. So frequent could go well with what we discussed in regards to low stakes, formative feedback. Immediate, however, I would say with immediate that there might be situational factors that affect that. So it's really dependent on your course and what that means, and how the semester progresses for your course. Discriminating. So it's based on clear criteria and standards for each of those criteria. So where you're distinguishing between good and poor performance. And that could be done in, for example, a rubric, for example. So that's clear. When feedback is given, they can see, okay, like this was the criteria, these are the standards, and this is where I fit. And supportively. So again, supportive delivery, ensuring that students can actually hear the message. This also means that you can have a good balance between praise and critique, or telling them, communicating what needs to be improved next. So, in general, Fink, as quoted here from Fink, we do not just want students to learn to do something, we want them to do it well. And that means they need to understand what well means. All assessment is an attempt to measure the quality of something, and therefore, by definition, requires an appropriate set of criteria and standards. Communicating that in advance with your students is going to make them understand, okay, so they can clearly know what traits, if once you've identified all the traits that matter for a particular task, and then describe the levels of quality clearly, your feedback then can go hand in hand with that. So here's another framework for giving effective feedback, and now we're kind of transitioning towards what does effective feedback look like when it actually comes to writing feedback. So first of all, it should be constructive. So that's where it's building on strengths of the students while suggesting improvements. So for example, instead of making it about the person, you make it about the content. So for example, your questions made the class engaging. Consider addressing them to the whole group, for example. It should be actionable, so focused on changeable actions. So instead of, you look nervous, say, try not holding a pen, it distracts from your message. So you're basically saying what was observable and suggesting a change. Oh, whoops. Sorry. Here we go. And objective. So use consistent standards of measure, be non-judgmental, so ground feedback in criteria. So instead of the colors didn't work, say blue font on black background makes text difficult to read. So you're being very specific, and again, you're grounding your feedback in the criteria of whatever the task required. And specific, be precise, tell students what needs to be changed. Instead of your presentation was disorganized, say the connection between your main argument and conclusion wasn't clear. So this allows them to receive it while managing the emotional dimensions of feedback. Yeah, so basically, again, research shows that learners use feedback when it is credible, based on direct observation from a trusted source, constructive and forward-looking. So with that, also the other effective feedback requires bi-directional dialogue. So meaning attention to emotions, strong student-teacher relationships, and a developmental focus. That's when it is received really well. And here is an example of ineffective versus effective feedback. So again, ineffective, your points are not clear, your writing is not where it should be, you need more literature. Whereas instead, you could have something like, you seem to be missing some articles in your sentences, which sometimes makes your points unclear. Instead, read work out loud to see if it might be missing. You might be missing them in your final draft, etc. And also pointing them to the right supports that they could get. The other methods, and I don't know if anybody's heard of these before, probably have, but it's a feedback workshop, so we'll just talk about it quickly. There's also these little like hacks you could use. So the sandwich method, which is a strength, a problem, and then a strength. So that's, for example, your intro is clear, sets a strong foundation. Try to discuss some more recent peer-reviewed research. You're on the right track. Adding more sources will make your argument even stronger. The XYZ approach. So when you do X, Y happens, so try to do Z. When you use only one peer-reviewed article, your opinion comes across as biased. Including 3 demonstrates diversity and a well-balanced perspective. Self-disclosure. So this is where you can sort of relate to the student. So I also struggled with X when I was an undergrad. I found Y to be helpful. It seems your paper has, so for example, it seems your paper has a lot of APA errors. When I was an undergrad, I had trouble with this too. Try using, and then you just start to give them some recommendations. So these are some of strategies that you could use in providing feedback to make sure that, again, like what we discussed in the challenges, that it is received better, that there's a positive outcome, and that it avoids the emotional strain that comes with feedback. So, right, so this, I kind of spoke to this in a second ago, but again, the emotional dimensions of feedback, super important to be aware of, and knowing that feedback benefits learners most when it's a bi-directional dialogue and there's positive relationships, and also when they are informed of the purpose behind it, and when it's integrated in course design. So that way it doesn't feel like, oh, this is the final assignment and this feedback just feels like a justification for a grade, but it's more so throughout the course in whatever increment makes sense for you, for the assignment, for example, or the grading components where it's more formative, low stakes, and it's used towards a developmental focus for the learner. And again, this is a visual that really helps me, but when we look at effective feedback cycle, there's also the dimension we talked about of discovering issues, so self-discovery and assisted discovery. So there's like reflection in the part of the learner to become more agents of their own learning, right? And so basically they can analyze causes and consequences, create options, commit to action, and evaluate performance improvement. So there's this cycle that helps make feedback more useful. So the other component, was that there should be action taken on the feedback. So it's not just, again, like this dead end, but more of something that they're given an opportunity to act upon. So with that, the other part of this workshop was to get feedback from your students and reflect on that. And I do want to say that we have the recording of Gathering Evidence of Teaching Effectiveness by my colleague Jackie Dang, which is posted under the Thriving Academia workshop series. So the link is also there, where it's more focused on how instructors can gain feedback from students and what are the different ways of approaching that, and using it for your personal development and for your teaching dossier development. So please check that out. And for that reason, since that is out, I will only cover a little bit of that today and mostly focused on how you can collect feedback from students. So why might we collect evidence of teaching effectiveness? Well, to learn and reflect on your teaching, to gather feedback from your students for research. So for example, for scholarship of learning and teaching, and professionally to build your teaching dossier. And every time that I teach, I make sure I have some sort of Google form that asks students how I did. And I also, talking about formative feedback, I collect a formative feedback along the course from them. So at the end of every session, I have a link to the form and I say, okay, so fill this out for whatever I need to improve on. And that's where I can really gauge, okay, these things are working in the course or not working, and take action throughout. So we know student evaluations of teachings can be limited, and that is the most widespread institutional mechanism through which individual teaching is evaluated. And the questions there are usually to answer on a Likert scale and include categories like instructor clarity, enthusiasm, how often you're available. But it has some issues like measuring how much an instructor is liked rather than how effective they are, and is subject to bias, like equity deserving faculty tend to score less well. So for that reason, I'm going to give you some strategies that you could use and make your own questions, or get a measure of how you're doing from your students within the course and throughout the course. So the evidence, there's also a best practices link here, evaluating your teaching, which actually includes ways that you could build your questions. The evidence for how well you're doing can come from course surveys, which are very specific about teaching impacted learning, not just, how well they enjoyed the course. So these can have specific questions like how did a particular practice support their learning. Interview and testimonials, informal feedback like emails, letters, notes, and samples of student work. Ask for permission and anonymize, but you could use that as well for evidence from students about you giving feedback to them in that way. So what I do in my teaching is I use the stop, start, continue model, because it's just so easy and students follow it really well. So they're asked to provide responses indicating what they wish to stop in your teaching practice and what they wish you would start incorporating. And finally, they can also describe what aspects of your teaching they enjoy and want you to continue. And when I do this in my course, they usually say that to continue using videos, using images and diagrams. And then for start, I actually had some really cool recommendations from students, and I try to implement them as much as I can. And also there's like suggestions for stop. The other one is muddiest point. So students are asked to note the most unclear or muddiest point of each lesson, of a particular lesson. And students may also be asked to describe what could have been done differently to help them understand the material. A 1-minute paper, which could be administered at the end. They're used to gauge the levels of students' understanding of the particular topic. So these are all quick, informative ways of giving you feedback directly from students about your teaching. Yep, this is an example of stop, start, continue. And overall, as Jackie would have covered it, and I only just covered the students component part here, but please check out the other workshop as it has everything there. So you're collecting evidence from your students, yourself, and your colleagues on basically using these as evidence from each source to support your claims and beliefs about teaching, which would go in a teaching dossier. And there's also a best practices on teaching dossiers that you could consult. With that, I'd like to say thank you for listening to the workshop, but also for continued conversations. I have all of the names of educational developers on our team. Each one has a particular focus area. So see which ones who you'd like to engage with. We also have our Excellence in Teaching program. This is for instructors, and it's a professional development in teaching program that leads participants through a 5-step path, and you could get certificates along the way. So please check this out if you'd like to further engage with our office. And I also wanted to bring to your attention the teaching feedback program. So the link is over here where you could go in and see how you can request a teaching observation or a teaching refinement. There are 2 options. So option 1 is a teaching observation. It's a 30-minute initial consultation with one educational developer. And then the ED will come to your class for a 60-minute observation, and then there's a debrief involved. This is all totally optional, and you could use it as a way to grow and learn within your teaching. There's a teaching refinement where, again, you have an initial consultation, and then the educational developer visits your class and leads a 20-minute anonymous group discussion with your students. That's where you step out of the classroom at that time. Then you have a 30-minute debrief consultation to review the feedback together and reflect on the refinement. And further, I have the links here to our consultation page and email if you'd like to request a consultation. If there's anything that was really interesting and exciting, or you have further questions from this workshop, for example, and you'd like to bring your course or an assignment or anything around feedback, we can have more of a one-on-one conversation and support you there. We have our teaching resources, and then if you want to engage with our programming, workshops and events, we have all of that here as well. And if you like to stay up to date, you can join TeachNet, where you can get information on upcoming events, programs, grants, etc. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to stop the recording, and we can take a few minutes for question and answer.